So if you could imagine that you were sitting in a boat just off the coast of Darwin, and as you're just sitting there doing nothing, a fish jumps into your boat. That would be a good day. You know, you're not even attempting to go fishing, and they're coming to you. Now, if a few minutes later 20 fish jumped into your boat, you would start to suspect that there's something going on underneath the water. There is something under the surface that they're trying to get away from. They would much rather be with you than with whatever's under there. Now, if 100 or 1,000 fish jumped into your boat, then you've got a problem. Okay, you need a bigger boat. And you need to suddenly learn how to start cooking very good fish curry. Now, strange analogy, but this is actually something that's happening in the church at the moment. Some of you may have seen reports that all around the world at Easter time, there were record numbers of baptisms. France had over 10,000 baptisms. I think it was like 45% more than the previous year. Sydney and Melbourne, they had record numbers. You know, we've been seeing this all around the world. I was reading an article even from Malaysia. They were saying the same thing. They've been having record numbers of baptisms. But they were pointing out that the curious thing is that it's not as though people have been suddenly evangelizing more than normal. You know, if the church had spent the last 12 years or 12 months devoted to mission, you know, going out on the streets to proclaim the gospel, you could understand. But the curious thing is that we've still been just as asleep as we normally are. The fish have been jumping into the boat. Now, this is the point where we need to stop and say, well, something's happening under the surface of the water, causing them to jump in. And this is, I think, the really interesting thing. You know, we're very aware that the world we live in has becoming more and more godless. You know, we're very much in this post-Christian society. And for a long time, people have been saying that we don't actually need God because we can be good without God. You know, society will just be just as moral and ordered and, you know, beautiful as it always was. And yet what a number of Christian commentators were pointing out for many years was our society is running off the fumes of Christianity. You know, it's the remnants of Christian morality holding the system together, even though we've stopped going to church, we've stopped believing in Jesus. But there comes a point where suddenly those fumes run out and everything starts to descend into chaos. And I think this is what we're starting to see. This last couple of years, there is a level of craziness coming upon our society which actually suggests that that moral fabric of our society is now falling apart. We've now got to a generation of people where they simply don't know that moral code. And this is where the interesting thing is happening, that most of these conversions are happening amongst young people. The older generations who were kind of brought up in that Christian culture are probably still living off that Christian culture, even though they've abandoned Christ. But it's the younger generations who realize that they're now living in a very ugly world, where the way that people treat each other is horrible, really. And they want out. They don't want to be part of that. They're looking for hope. They're looking for something better. And so they're coming to church looking for an alternative. We had a society which basically said that if there is no God, you can do whatever you want. And so it's really convenient to be an atheist, because it means that you can just do anything with no consequences. The alternative of following Christ was really difficult, because there's rules, there's obligations, there's commandments, but there's also hope. You know, people have realized that that first option of endless liberty actually is a dead end. There comes a point where things stop being fun and they just start being endlessly painful. Whereas to actually step into the life of Christ becomes a life of freedom. This is something that we need to be waking up to as a church. There's a real danger that we take our faith for granted. You know, if you grew up in a Christian family, you know, you've always been Christian. If anything, the tendency is that we're a little bit embarrassed about our faith. You know, we can go to work and we kind of hide it. You know, we're embarrassed, we're afraid that people are going to think we're weird. And we fail to realize that actually a lot of those people are desperate to know that you're a Christian. They're looking around hoping that someone's going to give them a way out of the mess. And if you actually put your head above the trenches for a bit and actually say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, rather than getting hate and rejection, you might actually find a whole bunch of questions. This is where we're at in our society now, that it's almost like the tide is turning. Many people have said that, you know, this journey of progressiveness is a progression away from God. But actually, for a long time, the tide was going out, but now the tide's coming back in. And this is where I think this gospel today is important. We need to get back to a place of responding to that call of Christ. As a church, we need to get our act together and learn how to deal with the people who are looking for Christ. This gospel, this is John chapter 21. Right at the end, after the resurrection, the disciples are in the boat, and Jesus calls them to put the nets on the other side of the boat. Now, we're familiar with this story. You know, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in those three Gospels, the Gospels begin with this story. That's the way that Jesus called the disciples originally. And after Peter hauls in the net of fish, Jesus says, I'm giving you a new job. Your job is no longer about catching fish, but it's now about catching people. You're going to become fishers of men. Now, John doesn't begin the gospel with that story, but he finishes with it. And you very much get the impression that this is the second time this has happened. Because as soon as it happens, Jesus doesn't need to give any commentary. He doesn't need to explain what's gone on. The disciples know exactly what's happened. Christ is saying, now is the time to go out. You've seen the resurrection. You've seen me rise from the tomb and defeat the power of sin and death. Now is the time for you to step out into the world and start bringing people in. This is almost like John's version of the Great Commission. You know, in Matthew's gospel, we hear Jesus saying, go out and make disciples of all the nations. In John's gospel, Jesus just says, that's a big pile of fish, isn't it? That's now your job. And it's kind of curious. In this gospel, it says that when they brought this net in, there were 153 fish. If you go back to the earliest theologians in the church, they spent so much time trying to understand why that particular number. St. Jerome has this curious thing where he says that at that time in history, there were 153 known species of fish. And so he kind of says, maybe this was Jesus trying to say something about every nation, every culture, every people are going to come in to know the resurrection. And so there's something very powerfully symbolic here. Our job is to go out and proclaim Christ crucified and risen. Now, this is a little bit different to the way we normally think. For a long time, the church has been so focused on this sort of tribal mentality. You know, religion was something that you just claimed as a name. You know, you're Buddhist, you're Hindu, you're Christian, or even within the churches, okay? You're Baptist, you're Pentecostal, you're Catholic. And so much of our evangelization was almost like trying to win people to a different group. You know, it's like trying to convince someone to join a different football team. But it was all very superficial. It was like just the surface layer of your life. Whereas what Jesus is talking about is complete transformation. See the world through the lens of the resurrection. If life ends at the point of your death, then life is really meaningless. There is no reason to be a good person except for the fact that it might give you a bit of a kickback. You know, really, at the end of the day, you can use and abuse anyone around you as long as you can enjoy the short span of life that you've got on earth. But if Christ is risen from the dead, if eternity has been opened up for us, then suddenly everything changes. Life has meaning, it has purpose. Even the worst bits of life have meaning and purpose. Suffering, hardship. All of these things are preparing us for eternity. As St. Paul says, I count the sufferings of this present time as preparing me to carry a weight of eternal glory. That vision of the resurrection changes our whole perspective on life. And that is what people are hungering for. They know that life is difficult, that life is suffering. They just want to know that that suffering goes somewhere. Because if it doesn't, there's no more reason to live. We need to encounter that transformation so that we can proclaim that vision. We need to know that Christ is risen. We need to know that he stands in our midst, still powerful, living amongst us, so that we can go out and proclaim that he is in the midst of those who are suffering. When the disciples went out on mission, they didn't spend 10 years studying theology, trying to make sure that they had all the right arguments. They would just go up and start praying for people for healing. And people were healed. And then they would say, by the way, let me introduce you to the guy who just healed you. Not me, it was Jesus. That's really how simple evangelization should be. It's about witnessing the risen Christ, bringing him into the midst of those who are longing for hope. So we need to know Christ. In this time of Easter, we need to delve into the scriptures to meet him in the Word of God. We need to pray for the Holy Spirit to bring our faith to life. But there's another side to this, where as a church, we need to be in a place where we can receive people. Once again, if you go back to the beginnings of the Gospels, when Jesus called the disciples, there's this curious bit where James and John are sitting on the shore of Galilee mending their nets. And at that point, Jesus calls them. I've always read that passage and thought there's actually something powerful in that. Because for any fisherman, if you've got a big hole in your net, you're wasting your time. The fish are coming to you, but they're swimming straight through the net. As a community, we need to be mending our nets. Because God is sending people to us, but then they're leaving because no one has spoken to them. No one has prayed with them. No one has walked alongside them and accompanied them towards faith. As a community, we need to change our whole way of doing church, the whole mentality, to not just come here as individuals, receive our spiritual fill-up, and then go home. But we need to realize that as a community, we are on mission every time we come to church on Sunday. We are the net catching the visitors coming in. If you've spent your whole life knowing Christ, then you are the privileged few. Okay, you've received a privilege that very few have. And with that comes the responsibility of sharing that faith with those who are seeking. And so the first thing is, you need to know who your fellow parishioners are and who the visitors are. If you don't know each other, then you don't know who the stranger is. We then need to change our whole mentality. So instead of coming to church and then doing the mad dash to the car park so we can get out quickly, rather we need to come with a mentality of, I'm going to hang around for 15 minutes afterwards and look around for the person who's sitting alone, or the person who's still kneeling in the pew, possibly crying because they've had such a bad week? How do I get alongside them? How do I pray with them and minister to them? If, as a community, we could start to operate like that, we would need a bigger boat, okay? We are going to need a church 4 times the size of this one. Christ is trying to bring people back to his church, but he's looking for a church that's prepared to receive them. And if we can't receive them, he'll send them elsewhere. So we really need to be praying for our own conversions at this time, to go deeper into the mystery of the resurrection and deeper into that great commission of Christ. To realize that that commission was not for someone else, it was for you. Go out and make disciples of all the nations. To witness to how Christ has resurrected you, how he has transformed you, so that your life becomes this beacon of light in a dark world.